This is the third in a series of mini lectures on horror fiction. In the first lecture, we looked at death and the ancients and the background historical context in the form of documented cases of the undead and the subsequent 18th century vampire controversy. In the second lecture, we examined the development of Gothic literature, which brought us to the early part of the 19th century, where we'll take up the story with the emergence of vampire fiction by looking at a few key 19th century texts, before trying to make sense of it all through the application of theory, and finally saying something about what the Gothic and horror fiction more generally offers the creative writer. Vampire fiction became the most important subgenre of Gothic literature, and grew out of its obsession with the supernatural, the exotic, the tabooed, and with death. So let's go back to the night in 1816 when Byron was entertaining Mary Godwin and her husband-to-be Percy Shelley at his residence on Lake Geneva. Now the weather was so bad they stayed home and decided to write stories to amuse and scare each other. This was when Mary began writing Frankenstein. But besides Byron, Mary and Percy, there was one other person with them, John Polidori, Byron's physician. That night, Byron began writing a vampire story, which he abandoned, but which Polidori took up and developed and published in 1819 as The Vampire. And it's generally thought of, if not the first vampire story, certainly the prototype for what was to follow. Now, in this story, we have a Byronic hero, the mysterious gloomy aristocrat, Lord Ruthven, who is manipulative and deceitful and preys off high society and virtuous women. Needless to say, the story was very influential. Interestingly, as you see from the picture, the story was attributed to Lord Byron, despite denials from Byron and objections from Polidori. But the fact it was misrepresented as being written by Lord Byron might explain the extent of its influence. And I think a number of the novel's characteristics continue to the present day, through Stoker's Dracula and into the work of Anne Rice, for example, with their dark anti-heroes, their aristocratic protagonists. Now, there were numerous instances of vampire tales that followed across Europe, including by Dumas, Gogol and Tolstoy. Not Leo, but another member of the family, Alexei. There were even vampire operas. But I'm going to stick with the development in the islands of Britain and Ireland for the present, as this is where the growth of vampire fiction was most important, and I'll pull out a few highlights. We'll start at the cheap sensationalistic end with Varney the Vampire, which sold for a penny and in which we begin to see the development of many of the traits that have become tropes we now associate with vampires. So Varney has fangs. There are puncture wounds on necks of victims. Varney can hypnotize his victims. He's unusually strong. However, there's still no problem with daylight or Christian symbols at this point. And I think you can get a flavour of the sensationalism inherent in these penny dreadfuls, as they were called, from the cover of the novel on the right. And then there was Sheridan Le Fanu, the Irish Gothic novelist and short story writer, famous for his ghost stories. He was very influential, and his best known works are Uncle Silas, In a Glass Darkly, and of course Carmilla, his great work of vampire fiction. Now Carmilla is a lesbian vampire story, and if you've seen the rather silly Lesbian Vampire Killers movie, you'll know the longevity of its influence. It certainly influenced Le Fanu's fellow Dubliner, Bram Stoker. For interestingly enough, descriptions of the title character in Carmilla and of Lucy in Dracula are similar. So here you have the archetypes of female waif-like victims and of rosy-cheeked, slender, languid, large-eyed, full-lipped, soft-voiced, seductive female vampires. So Carmilla was undoubtedly an influence on Stoker. We might add, of course, that Le Fanu was influenced by the much earlier poem I should have mentioned, Christabel, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is the tale of a lesbian vampire-like creature. Anyhow, just to give you a flavour of Carmilla, this is from Laura, the female protagonist and narrator. She used to place her pretty arms about my neck, draw me to her, and laying her cheek to mine, murmur with her lips near my ear, blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with the tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardour of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering. And with gloating eyes she drew me to her, and her hot lips travelled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper, almost in sobs, "You are mine, you shall be mine, and you and I are one forever." Good stuff. Anyway, enough of lesbian vampires and on to the real thing, Dracula. Like Le Fanu, Stoker was also an Irishman and Dubliner, whose work in the English theatre with Henry Irving, alongside his sojourn in the Yorkshire seaside town of Whitby, were perhaps the two main sources of inspiration for the key text and masterpiece of vampire fiction, Dracula. And in Dracula, we have all the traits with which we are so familiar. So we have the aristocratic vampire, fear of crucifixes, light and garlic, the fact the vampire gives off no reflection, that vampires sleep in coffins and can transmogrify into bats, rats, dogs and so forth. And I think more interesting for us as writers of horror, there is both a transgressive sexuality and an epistolary narrative form, which maintains the tradition of Gothic literature through Shelley and Maturin in having experimental narration as a feature. Stoker's work, I hardly need say, has been and is massively influential in literature, film and television. I want to read you an extract from Harker's journal, in which he goes into a part of the castle Count Dracula had advised him against exploring. And it was good advice, for here Harker meets some female vampires. It goes like this. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive. And as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head, as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed to fasten on my throat. What wonderful writing! Not a word wasted, with a stark clarity to the visual images, the scarlet lips, the white teeth, and an overpowering erotic tension. Anyhow, there's more. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and I could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle, as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the super-sensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. Anyhow, just at this moment of suspended anticipation, the Count enters and angrily breaks up the gathering. The female vampires reproach the Count. "Are we to have nothing tonight?" said one of them with a low laugh, as she pointed to the bag which she had thrown upon the floor, and which moved as though there was some living thing within it. For answer he nodded his head. One of the women jumped forward and opened it. If my ears did not deceive me, there was a gasp and a low wail, as of a half-smothered child. The women closed round, whilst I was aghast with horror. But as I looked, they disappeared, and with them the dreadful bag. Then the horror overcame me, and I sank down unconscious. Clearly, this is all highly erotic, filled with desire, but also filled with disgust, which perhaps sums up the Victorian relationship to sexuality. And this intermingling of fascination, desire, and disgust are captured nicely in the representation of the scene in Coppola's film version, which is well worth a viewing. Now, I'm going to risk a diversion into theory here and offer a way of making sense of Gothic literature and of literature that involves fantasy and fantastic creatures, such as vampires, more generally. Note that when I'm talking about fantasy here, I'm not talking about a narrow literary genre, but about the whole phenomena of fantasizing, which includes cultural products such as the literature of fantasy, horror, ghosts, and so on. Now, to do this, I'm going to employ two important thinkers. Karl Marx, the greatest and most influential philosopher of the 19th century, and Sigmund Freud, perhaps the most important of the 20th century, certainly of the first half of the 20th century. There's a couple of important quotes I'd like you to remember. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also necessarily sublimates of their material life processes. So forget all this stuff and nonsense about ghosts and vampires really existing, and see them instead as phantasmagorical projections of real life processes and actual human relations. And the second quote, this time from Freud: "The motive forces of fantasies are unsatisfied wishes, and every single fantasy is the fulfillment of a wish, a correction of unsatisfying reality." And the contents of a fantasy are an expression of wish fulfillment, correcting what is wrong with reality. Now, why is this important? Let's just take a look in diagrammatic form. Here we have normality, the socially acceptable, if you like, inside the circle, and outside it we have the whole wealth of human experience. The critic Rosemary Jackson puts it like this: "Fantasy characteristically attempts to compensate for a lack resulting from cultural constraints. It's a literature of desire which seeks that which is experienced as absence and loss." So the white circle is the borderline of cultural constraint. But fantasy literature, and by this Jackson includes Gothic fiction, inhabits that area of desire beyond this realm. So we could represent it as follows. So we have the real, circumscribed, controlled, logical, understandable, and hovering outside of it, we have the fantastic. Georges Bataille, in his essay on Wuthering Heights, describes it as follows: "In Wuthering Heights, as in Greek tragedy, it's not the law itself that is denounced. What it forbids is simply described as an essentially human domain made for man." So the forbidden or tabooed realm, the realm of fantasy, the realm outside the law, outside of the real, the normal, the socially acceptable, is nevertheless a necessary dimension of human experience. And of course, there'd be no need for the law if it wasn't. So this is where we can unite Marx's and Freud's notions and begin to make sense of Gothic fiction. What is categorized as fantasy by society is by definition outside the category of the real. So by analysing what constitutes fantasy or the unreal, you can sketch out the borders of the real. In other words, understand the limits of a particular culture or society. So if we take the case of the vampire and look at the characteristics of the vampire, then they're the antithesis of the Victorian real, or as Freud would put it, they represent a return of the repressed of human experience. So we have wild sexuality, perverse sexuality. Think of the fangs and biting as making new holes. Overwhelming desire, which destroys the fabric of the socially acceptable Victorian restriction of sexuality to marriage, and with it notions of the good wife, the domestic wife, responsible patriarchy, and so on. In the excerpt we read from Stoker's novel, isn't Dracula exactly a parody of the patriarch, of the good Victorian father? Yes, he does what's expected of him and provides for his wives. But what does he bring? A sack full of babies for the female vampires to feast on. So why is the novel Dracula, for me, the most important one for understanding what constitutes Victorian society, and hence what it has meant to be British and still means to some extent? Because it precisely adumbrates the parameters of the Victorian real by what the vampire is not. The fantasy of the vampire is a fantasy of the wish fulfillment of Victorian society. To break the shackles of social restraint, of the responsible and bourgeois, to indulge in wild, perverse sex, and for the male to once again take on the mantle of power of the monstrously unrestrained aristocrat. Rosemary Jackson puts it this way. In expressing desire, fantasy can operate in two ways. It can tell of, manifest or show desire, or it can expel desire when this desire is a disturbing element which threatens cultural order. In many cases, fantastic literature fulfills both functions at once, for desire can be expelled through having been told of, and thus vicariously experienced by author and reader. In this way, fantastic literature points to or suggests the basis upon which cultural order rests, for it opens up for a brief moment onto disorder, onto illegality, onto that which lies outside the law. So in Dracula we see all that is repressed by Victorian society, sex, perversion, lust, violence, and so on. But we also see the cultural vengeance. Ultimately, Dracula is destroyed. And interestingly enough, we can return to a materialist interpretation of fantasy, combining those thoughts of Marx and Freud. Again, Jackson puts it neatly. From about 1800 onwards, those fantasies produced within a capitalist economy express some of the debilitating psychological effects of inhabiting a materialistic culture. They are peculiarly violent and horrific. And we might add that what is interesting about Gothic texts and about Stoker's Dracula is that we have a disintegration of the conventional notion of character. So we have madness in the form of Renfield and the lunatic asylum, and the transformation from one form of life into another, as illustrated in the transitioning of Lucy and the other vampire victims. And we also have the disintegration of conventional narrative structure, as the various fragments in the form of diaries, letters, newspaper articles, and so forth make up the text. This is, of course, significant in a century that saw the rise and triumph of literary realism in the novel, with their rounded three-dimensional characters and the objective, omniscient, external third-person narrator. The alternative literary strain of the Gothic works as a shadowy counterpart to this, and arguably this subjectivization and fragmentation of reality is closer to contemporary experience than that offered by the great 19th century realist novels. This would be the obvious moment to move on to the 20th century and the development of vampire fiction, particularly its transmogrification into the world of film, starting with Murnau's classic Nosferatu, through the films of Lugosi and Karloff in Hollywood, to the Hammer horror classics of the 60s in Britain, the re-emergence of the lesbian vampire in The Hunger, the genre shift in Coppola's film to romance, or to TV comedy in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, to explorations of relationships with the other in films such as Let the Right One In, or the saccharine domesticization of this in Twilight and the various kids' vampire cartoons. And of course, there is an interesting literature out there to be explored. But this is for another time. For the moment, and to finish, I'll just say a few words on what we as writers can take from the history of horror fiction. So what does the Gothic offer the creative writer? Well, in terms of subject areas, it's obviously useful in exploring death, as Anne Rice did in her Chronicles, but also other tabooed and subversive areas of human experience, in particular the violent, the erotic, the violent and erotic, sex and death, and all things sick and grotesque, things which can perhaps be more easily incorporated into a genre such as horror than into certain other genres. And let's not forget that psychological anxiety, fear. Now, the tradition of the Gothic has been an experimental one, particularly in terms of character and narrative form. So again, this is ripe fruit for the contemporary writer to pluck. And finally, it offers freedom, for the horror story floats in dimensions beyond the borders of the real. So feel free to break those boundaries that normally keep us sane but repressed, and indulge in the madness of your imaginations.